never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
3, 2, 1.
You have to imagine a launch so full of hope, it felt untouchable. The world called it Challenger. The shuttle meant to carry not just astronauts, but dreams. In January 1986, 7 astronauts stood on the pad at Cape Canaveral, carrying the ambitions of a nation. Among them was Christa McAuliffe, a schoolteacher chosen to bring space into the classroom. 73 seconds after liftoff, that hope shattered. The Challenger disappeared in a bloom of fire and vapor that left the world silent. In the days that followed, recovery crews swept the Atlantic, pulling fragments from the deep, scorched alloy, shattered panels, pieces of a dream now broken. But the story they uncovered didn't match what the public had been told. Some systems had remained powered. Several switches were still on. If the shuttle had disintegrated instantly, how could that be? What they found on the ocean floor wasn't only wreckage, but the record of a final fight for life. A truth more complex and far more human than anyone expected. The launch that changed everything. It was January 28, 1986. A clear, bitterly cold morning at Cape Canaveral. The temperature hovered below freezing, something no launch had ever faced before. Along the coast, families, reporters, and engineers gathered to watch the Challenger climb into history. On board were 7 astronauts, among them Christa McAuliffe, a schoolteacher chosen to bring space into the classroom. She would be the first civilian to teach from orbit, a symbol of how far ordinary people could reach. For millions, the mission felt like a promise that humanity was learning to rise together. At 11:38 a.m., the engines ignited. Fire and smoke billowed from the pad as the shuttle began its ascent. It climbed clean and steady, 1,000 feet, 2,000, 5,000, flawless against the blue. Then, 73 seconds after liftoff, a flash tore across the sky. The solid rocket boosters veered away. A white cloud bloomed where the shuttle had been. For a few seconds, people thought it was part of the show. Then the vapor trails split apart and the sound was gone. Inside Mission Control, the voice came through the static. Calm, almost routine. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction inside the control room. The data screens froze as one by one, the signals disappeared. The telemetry was gone. The external tank had ruptured, scattering debris across the Atlantic at 48,000 feet. As the footage replayed across the world, one question began to take shape. Quiet. Relentless. Did the crew die in that instant, or were they still alive as the shuttle fell from the sky? That question would pull divers, investigators, and scientists into the depths, not only to find answers, but to face what remained. The search beneath the waves. The Atlantic that winter was cruel and cold. Navy divers and NASA engineers worked through storms and freezing seas, sweeping hundreds of square miles in search of the lost shuttle. Waves hammered the recovery ships as sonar grids began to map the ocean floor. The explosion had scattered the Challenger across nearly 30 square kilometers. A field of twisted aluminum, scorched insulation, and broken composites lying 70 meters down. Each vessel carried side-scan sonar and remote cameras. The water temperature at that depth averaged just 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough to numb the divers within minutes. Sonar pulses swept through the dark, returning ghostly outlines that blurred between wreckage and shadow. Every contact was marked, logged, and assigned a coordinate. Each descent meant hours in darkness, visibility reduced to only a few meters. But as the fragments mounted, one question began to surface. How could a system engineered with such precision dissolve into chaos so completely? By early February, hundreds of pieces had been retrieved. Segments of fuselage, fragments of the solid rocket boosters, torn heat tiles. Engineers tried to reconstruct the order of failure, but the data refused to align. Some components bore burn patterns inconsistent with an instantaneous explosion. Others were bent inward, as if collapsed by pressure. The one section they could not locate was the crew cabin, the shuttle's pressurized core. Footage from the launch showed it tumbling away intact, spinning end over end after the breakup. That meant it had survived for a time. If the structure held together through the blast, what else inside had survived with it? Weeks passed before a sonar trace revealed a larger shape buried in silt, 6 nautical miles from the initial impact grid. The echo was dense, metallic, matching the forward section's mass signature. When divers reached the site, their lights cut through the gloom and caught the curve of a white cylinder, crumpled but unmistakable, the Challenger's crew module. The recovery was deliberate and wordless. Each fragment was photographed, tagged, and sealed in vacuum containers. When the final section was hoisted to the surface, the ocean went unnaturally still. No one spoke. Once on deck, NASA officials took control. The wreckage was shrouded beneath tarps and flown to Cape Canaveral under guard. To the public, it was logged as mission debris, but to those who touched it, it was something else entirely. The last record of what happened in those 73 seconds. And if the cabin truly remained intact, then the next question was unavoidable. What condition were the astronauts in when it hit the water? Inside the crew compartment, when the crew cabin arrived at Cape Canaveral, it was taken to a restricted hangar known as the Debris Analysis Facility. Only a small circle of personnel were cleared to enter: forensic experts, engineers, and medical investigators. What they saw confirmed what NASA had feared all along. The astronauts had not died in the explosion. The cabin, though crushed and scorched, had remained structurally intact during the initial breakup. The detonation that tore the Challenger apart had separated the module cleanly from the rest of the shuttle, sending it on a ballistic arc that carried it upward another 65,000 feet before gravity pulled it back toward the Atlantic. The fall lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. At impact, the module struck the ocean at more than 330 kilometers per hour, a force equal to nearly 200 G. It should have been instant death, but evidence suggested that at least some of the crew were alive during that descent. Investigators discovered that 3 personal oxygen packs, belonging to Commander Francis Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, and mission specialist Judith Resnick, had been manually activated. The switches could only have been turned on by hand. Pressure gauges showed that oxygen had flowed for several seconds after separation. That single discovery changed everything. It meant that for part of those final minutes, the crew understood what was happening. They had time to act, to reach for life support, to call to one another, to brace for impact inside a falling spacecraft. What does it mean to follow procedure when there is no longer any chance of survival? The cabin's interior told the rest of the story. The panels were charred and twisted, but the instruments showed brief surges of power after the breakup. Emergency systems trying to engage. Seats were torn loose, the control consoles crushed, yet many switches were still frozen mid-sequence, caught between on and off. They had followed their training until the end. One investigator later said, "They were alive, they were aware, and they were fighting." The realization devastated NASA. For weeks, the findings were classified, discussed only in closed briefings. Officially, the agency maintained that the crew died instantly. Privately, the evidence suggested something much more painful: that the Challenger disaster was not a single moment of death, but a drawn-out fall into silence. And as investigators reconstructed those final minutes, another question began to emerge. One far beyond the wreckage itself. If the crew fought to the very last second, then why were they ever placed in that position at all? The warnings NASA ignored. Long before that cold morning in January 1986, the warnings had already been written. At Morton Thiokol, the Utah-based contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, engineers had identified a small component that could destroy an entire spacecraft: a rubber O-ring meant to seal the joints between booster segments. Under normal launch conditions, the O-rings expanded with pressure, creating an airtight seal. But in cold weather, the rubber stiffened, shrinking just enough to let superheated gases escape. The risk wasn't theoretical. Test data and previous flights had already shown signs of erosion. Each time, engineers raised alarms. Each time, the issue was logged, discussed, and then deferred. In the days before the launch, Florida's temperature dropped to near-record lows. On the morning of January 27th, ice formed on the launch tower. Engineers at Thiokol grew increasingly anxious. Roger Bois-Joly, one of the senior engineers, spent the night before the launch compiling data, charts, and photos showing how O-ring performance deteriorated below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast for launch day was 29 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than any previous flight. During a late-night teleconference with NASA, Thiokol engineers made their case. The joints might not seal, the booster could fail. One manager summarized the risk bluntly. If we launch tomorrow, we stand a good chance of losing the vehicle and crew. But NASA's managers pressed for certainty, not caution. The data, they said, was inconclusive. At the end of the call, after internal debate and pressure from NASA, Thiokol's executives reversed their engineers' recommendation. The launch was approved. At 11:38 a.m. the next morning, the flaw announced itself. 60 seconds after liftoff, cameras captured a flicker of flame near the right booster, a bright jet escaping from a joint that should have been sealed. The flame widened, cutting into the metal strut that anchored the booster to the external fuel tank. At T plus 73 seconds, the joint failed completely. The hydrogen tank ruptured. The shuttle disintegrated in midair. When the Rogers Commission began its investigation, the findings were damning. Engineers had known the O-rings were vulnerable for years. Internal memos dating back to 1982 warned of catastrophic failure in cold weather. NASA managers had even labeled the defect a flight risk, but continued to fly, reclassifying the problem as an acceptable anomaly. During a televised hearing, physicist Richard Feynman demonstrated the flaw for the world. He placed an O-ring sample into a glass of ice water, then bent it. The rubber stayed rigid, refusing to spring back. For a successful technology, he said, reality must take precedence over public relations. For nature cannot be fooled. The Challenger disaster was not a failure of machinery, but of judgment. It wasn't just a tragedy of design, it was a tragedy of decision. And as investigators looked again at the recovered crew cabin, one truth became impossible to ignore. The astronauts had done everything right. It was the system around them that failed. By March 1986, after nearly 2 months of searching, the remains of the Challenger crew were finally brought home. The recovery was conducted in absolute secrecy, handled by Navy divers, forensic specialists, and NASA pathologists working under strict non-disclosure orders. At Cape Canaveral, the hangars once used for shuttle assembly became both a morgue and a laboratory. Each set of remains was sealed in an individual container, marked with grid coordinates from the ocean floor. Identification was slow and meticulous. The impact had been catastrophic, yet through dental records, DNA fragments, and remnants of uniform fabric, every crew member was eventually identified. NASA's internal memo recorded the discovery with chilling restraint. Human remains recovered in good condition considering impact velocity. But among those who carried out the task, there was no detachment, only silence. Devers later spoke of the weight of that work, how beneath the surface, they felt less like rescuers and more like witnesses to something sacred. When the reports were finalized, NASA made a decision that would define the aftermath. The details of the recovery, the condition of the remains, the sequence of discovery, the full autopsy findings, were classified indefinitely. The families were informed privately. The public was told only what ceremony allowed. On May 20th, 1986, the 7 astronauts were laid to rest beneath a single bronze monument at Arlington National Cemetery. The plaque bore their names, and President Reagan's words, "They slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." Yet behind the public tribute, unease persisted. Inside NASA, some questioned the culture of silence. the way the agency buried not just evidence, but memory itself. Engineers were told to move on. Recovery teams were reassigned. The hangar that once held the wreckage was quietly emptied. Only fragments remained. Scorched metal, shattered tiles, the remnants of human courage fused into alloy. And for those who had seen the inside of the Challenger's cabin, the silence was never complete. They carried the truth that could never be released. In their final moments, the crew did not die in panic or despair. They stayed at their posts. They followed their training. They fought to live. Until there was nothing left to fight for. The lessons written in fire. In the aftermath of the Challenger disaster, shock spread far beyond NASA. For the first time in history, the American space program had failed live before millions. A moment that forced the nation to confront how ambition, bureaucracy, and politics had overshadowed caution. President Reagan ordered an immediate investigation. The Rogers Commission was formed. A panel of astronauts, scientists, engineers, and civilians charged with uncovering what went wrong. What they found was devastating. The Challenger disaster was not an accident, it was a decision. Internal memos revealed that warnings about the O-rings had been circulating for years. Engineers had documented burn marks, erosion, and heat damage. Yet managers prioritized maintaining the shuttle's schedule and NASA's image over safety. Concerns were labeled non-critical. The commission described NASA's internal process as a flawed chain of command, where data was filtered until it sounded acceptable. But beyond the technical breakdown was something deeper, a loss of perspective. The space shuttle, once a symbol of exploration, had become routine. Launches were scheduled like airline flights, astronauts treated as passengers, and risk treated as a calculation rather than a truth. The commission's findings forced NASA to rebuild itself. The shuttle fleet was grounded for nearly 3 years while the agency redesigned booster seals and restructured its entire safety system. The O-rings were replaced with new materials capable of withstanding freezing temperatures. More importantly, the culture of silence was broken. Engineers like Roger Boisjoli, who had tried to stop the launch, were vindicated, though few considered it a victory. Boisjoli became a reluctant figure of conscience, living with the knowledge that he had been right too late. Inside NASA, his name became a reminder that silence could kill. From then on, no launch would proceed without unanimous approval from every engineering team involved. Still, the shadow of Challenger never faded. For the children who watched their teacher disappear into the sky, for the technicians who saw the telemetry go dark, for the divers who lifted the wreckage, the image endured. Even decades later, NASA veterans called it not a failure, but a turning point. The day the agency relearned that progress without humility is peril. As astronaut Sally Ride, who served on the Rogers Commission, later wrote, "Space is worth the risk, but the risk must be known, not forgotten. We owe them that much." The 7 who died aboard Challenger were not victims of space, but of human overconfidence. And through that loss, they became teachers, reminding us that the sky will always demand honesty before it grants permission to fly. The legacy of the fallen 7. Nearly 4 decades later, the Challenger still flies. Not across the sky, but through memory. Its wreckage lies sealed beneath Cape Canaveral, unseen. Yet the story it tells continues to guide every launch that follows. Inside NASA's training halls, the names Scobie, Smith, Onizuka, Resnick, McNair, Jarvis, and McAuliffe are spoken with quiet respect. They are remembered not for how they died, but for why they flew, for believing that discovery is worth the risk of failure. Every new generation of astronauts studies the Challenger mission. But have we truly learned what it tried to teach? How easily can pride, routine, or silence return, hidden behind progress? From that tragedy came transformation. NASA rebuilt itself. From confidence to accountability. From momentum to mindfulness. The go fever that once pushed launches forward was replaced by something slower, wiser. Humility. At Arlington National Cemetery, 7 bronze stars shine above their names. Each time a rocket lifts from the same coast, engineers pause. Not from fear, but remembrance. As you watch the footage now, ask yourself how much of that courage still lives in us, because the Challenger never truly fell. It became part of the foundation that carries humanity upward. A reminder of the price and the purpose of reaching for the stars.